with all the tragedy that happened with that, we also learned some things. During when people were secluded in their houses, all over the world, something strange started to happen. They started to look out their windows and they started to notice animals. They started to notice the owl that would land in the tree or the coyote crossing the yard. Um, and what happened was, particularly with kids, during isolation, they began to have relationships with those animals that would come back. And they did not feel so alone.
So Staten Islander News Organization is here with Richard Louv. Richard Louv is a journalist and author of 10 books, including Our Wild Calling, How Connecting with Animals Can Transform Our Lives and Save Theirs. Last Child in the Woods, Saving Our Children from Nature Deficit Disorder, and The Nature Principle, Reconnecting with Life in a Virtual Age. His books have been translated and published in 24 countries and helped launch an international movement to connect children, families, and communities to nature. He is co-founder and chairman emeritus of the Children in Nature Network, an organization helping build the movement. He appears frequently on national radio and television programs and speaks internationally on nature deficit disorder, a concept he first introduced in Last Child in the Woods on the importance of children's and adults' exposure to nature for their health and on the need for environmental protection and preservation for greater access to nature and the health of the earth. He has presented keynote addresses at many conferences, including American Academy of Pediatrics National Conference and the USC Institute for Integrative Health Conference. In 2008, he was awarded the National Audubon Medal, prior recipients of which included Rachel Carson, E.O. Wilson, and President Jimmy Carter. He is the recipient of many other awards and medals related to his conservation work, and he has also written extensively for local, national, and international journals, and he has also served as a visiting scholar for several universities and on advisory boards for multiple charities. So, good afternoon, Richard, and it's great to have you with us. And the first question I had was, what made you want to write Our Wild Calling, your most recent book?
Well, it's some of the same motivation as for the other books. For instance, Last Child in the Woods. Believe it or not, I was a kid once, and I spent much of my boyhood in the woods. Uh, my parents seldom knew where I was, but my dog always did.
Mm-hmm.
And I connected very deeply with other animals. I didn't really know then why it felt so important, but it did. Um, there's a progression of books. The Last Child in the Woods was the first of these four on nature deficit disorder. The second one was vitamin N, which is things that people can actually do. And actually, the second one was the nature principle, which is about all of it. Third was vitamin N, and the last child, I'm sorry, Our Wild Calling was the most recent. And it's about our relationship with other animals specifically.
And your publisher also mentioned that you're actually writing a fifth book kind of on similar topics.
Allegedly.
um, and so what is the most surprising thing that you've come across or learned in your studies about animals or nature?
I think the most surprising thing takes a minute and a couple stories to tell. First, I asked many people to email me their stories of their relationships or encounters with other animals, including pets, but mainly wild animals. And I interviewed a lot of people about that. And I think I came away with about 100 stories that people told me. And not all of them are in the book. And there was a common denominator among most of them which was they described in one way or another, kind of altered state that they felt they were in when they had, for instance, an encounter when they made eye contact with a fox walking through their yard. What was that? And I heard that again and again from people who felt that sometimes they felt that time stopped or bent. They felt a different sense of scale in the world. You know, anytime you get down on the grass and you look at an anthill, your sense of what's large and what is small somehow changes. Um, and they felt something between them and the other animal right here. And as I looked into that, there's an idea that a philosopher talked about, which is that you and I don't really exist. What exists is between us. That without this relationship, we don't really exist, even over Zoom. And that's what people described, and that's what I'd experienced also. And if you have time and want to, I can tell you some stories about what people described exactly. But I decided that needed a name. And so I call it the habitat of the heart, this thing that's between us. And I believe that there are two habitats. There's the physical, natural habitat that we spend a lot of money and time trying to protect and nurture and teach our kids about. But then there's this other habitat, the habitat of the heart. And we spend very little time uh, thinking about that, supporting it, growing it, and teaching our kids about it. Thing is, though, that if one of those habitats goes, so does the other one. So I think the future of environmentalism has a lot to do with the habitat of the heart, and it's been largely ignored.
Yeah, if you wanted to share a couple of the stories that you were talking about, that would definitely be cool.
One of them is the story that the book opens with, which is uh, an oceanographer named Paul Dayton, who works at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. He's one of the among oceanographers. He's a very famous guy, one of the best. And he described to me when he was in college at the University of Washington, he would, and his buddies would go out and they would dive to the bottom of the Pacific and they would look for samples for their projects and also for lunch. And he was on the bottom of the Pacific once, turning things over, looking. And suddenly he intuitively felt that there was something large that came above him and stopped. It's usually not a good sign. And he looked up here and he saw a big tentacle coming down, and then another tentacle coming down. And then he looked up and, you know, risking anthropomorphism, Paul said it was one of those giant octopuses, Pacific octopuses, wingspan 12 feet. And it was looking down at me and it thought that I was a clam. And it came down and it got me. And it did. It grabbed him and held him tight with its tentacles. And he says, anybody who thinks those tentacles are soft, they're wrong. They're very hard. They're impossible to move. And they have protons in them. They have photons in them. They have some of the same cells that animals use to see. So this is so he said he didn't think that the octopus could see him with its arms, but it was certainly getting to know him a lot better. Um, Octopuses have what amounts to brains in each of their tentacles. They're very different from us. Uh, he pushed off the bottom of the ocean with as much force as he could. And he and the octopus began to go up. He was realizing he was out of oxygen, and they went up and spiraled up in the water. As they approached the top, the octopus was moving around Paul, his body, and Paul could feel its razor sharp beak coming around his neck. And he said finally he was looking in the eye of the octopus. And he says he can't explain it, but he felt that he and the octopus made a non-aggression pact at that point. And the octopus loosened up, moved back. And about that time, they both hit the surface of the water, both of them. And Paul ripped off his mask, and octopus starts to descend a little bit, and he can see that the octopus is still looking at him. They were still making eye contact. And what does he do next? He puts his mask back on, and he chases the octopus down. I said, Paul, why would you do such a thing? That's crazy. He said he doesn't know. All he knows is that he did not want those moments to end. And he very seldom uses the word spiritual. He's a hardcore scientist. And he said, I don't like using that word, but there was something about that I guess was spiritual. He didn't want these moments to end. And two short other stories, much shorter than that one. A little boy was lying on his living room carpet, and his mother, this is in Toronto, his mother walks in, and here's her little boy who has his arm around their dog, whose name is Jack. They're both lying on the floor. And she hears her little boy say, Mommy, I don't have a heart anymore. She says, what are you saying? And without looking up, her little boy said, my heart is in Jack. What is that? That permeability between us and another group. We know about that with other people. But this also happens, with other animals. And the final story is my own. I'm out in my boat on a lake. I have a little electric motor, and I see on the shore what I think are turkey vultures eating a dead carp on the shore. So I wanted to look at them closer. So I move up closer and get within about 20 feet of them. And they're not turkey vultures, they're two giant golden eagles. And for the next, again, time seemed to disappear just as it did for Paul. I would look at them and they would make eye contact. Then they would go down and they would get some of the carp and then look up at me again and down. It went on for a long time, or what felt like a long time. And in those moments, I also felt that there was something between us, and I had no name for it. And the time disappeared. And I couldn't explain. I went home later and told my son about it, and I said, I can't explain that feeling. So over and over again, the people who told me stories about encounters with wild animals or relationships over time with wild animals or with their pets describe something very similar. So I'm sorry it took so long to answer that, but that's the most surprising thing. And that became kind of the core of the book, this habitat of the heart, this different recognition of the relationship that we have with other animals.
Right. Well, that's awesome. So why do you think it's so hard for people to accept the intelligence and spiritual evolution of wild animals?
Because it's very old thinking. People kind of have in the past dismiss that as that's magical thinking. That's, attributing a soul to another animal. Of course, animals don't have souls and all of that. The irony is that people who dismiss that as New Age thinking, in the last 15 years, three areas of research have emerged that are amazing. They've emerged from science, not from New Age folk. And they're essentially underscoring what some of the New Age people have said all along. Those three areas are, one is the study of the human senses, that we have far more senses than we think we have. People who study the human senses no longer talk about five senses. they talk conservatively about 9 or 10 human senses. Some of them say we have as many as 30 human senses, and we don't use them all. We barely know the basics. So we're far more sensitive to what's going on around us than we actually consciously know. The second area of research is about animal and plant communication. That's exploded. Trees connect with each other through the mycelium, through the fungi that go between them in a forest. Forests are very connected under the earth. And there's a lot of theories about what they can do with that and how they warn each other, perhaps, when a insect infestation is beginning to move across the forest. There's a lot of theories about that. But the fact is that they're connected often, not always, but often. But also animals, studies of how animals communicate within their own species, but also across species and with us. And there's kind of a primitive first language, is what I call it, the first language, which we and many other animals share. And it's gestures, it's movements, it's the tone of the sounds we make. And it's very, very basic, but we've all shared that all along with other animals. And then the third area of research is both scientific and philosophic, and that's about the nature of consciousness. Not only our own, but consciousness of other creatures on Earth, both plant and animal, possibly. There's new theories about that scientists are beginning to look into and accept to a degree. And there's just a lot more going on out there than we have assumed. So the irony here is that hard science is beginning to reveal what was thought to be magic thinking as recently as 20 years ago.
Right. Yeah, I've read some of the Paul Stamets works about the mycelium and how they facilitate communication between trees and other plants and things like that. That's really interesting research. And I think he also just wrote, he just keeps writing books too. So my next question is, what can ordinary people do in order to have the connection you describe with wild animals?
Well, I think the most important thing is just to notice what's going on around you. An illustration of this is what happened during the pandemic. With all the tragedy that happened with that, we also learned some things. During when people were secluded in their houses, all over the world, something strange started to happen. They started to look out their windows and they started to notice animals. They started to notice the owl that would land in the tree or the coyote crossing the yard. And what happened was, particularly with kids, during isolation, they began to have relationships with those animals that would come back. And they did not feel so alone. They felt a sense of solace from the animals that were outside their window. That yes, they may have seen them before, but have they really seen them? That's when that habitat of the heart happened with many people, I think, during the pandemic. The other thing that happened is that all over the world, animals started showing up in the streets that people had not, to their knowledge, seen before. And some of them were big predators, tigers and lions and bears, walking down the middle of the street. People at the time thought that what was happening was that they were coming into the cities. Some of that was happening, but mainly many of the animals they saw had been there all along. Maybe not the bears and the lions and tigers, but the coyotes, the foxes. Suddenly these animals started showing up. It's unclear as to how much of that was actually animals changing their behavior patterns when they move into cities, and a lot of them have moved into cities already, diurnal animals that make their living during the day tend to become nocturnal to hide. When we disappeared, many of them did appear. They reverted to their natural patterns. There's a lot of thinking about that that's going on. It's more complicated than it may seem, but when people saw that and read about it, that was a kind of magical moment for many people. That it helped them envision a world in which humans and other animals, wild animals, coexist, live together. And I think that was another lesson of the pandemic.
And I know a lot of people also started because you couldn't do anything except go outside. In some places, you couldn't even do that. Like I know in New Jersey, they actually closed all their parks. But in New York, they just like put up signs that you had to be 12 feet apart and everywhere. I don't know if people actually listened or whatever, but that was the one thing you could do. You couldn't go to work, you couldn't go to school, you couldn't really go to the mall or the movies or any of these places, but you could go in the woods. And so a lot more people did, and then that ended up appearing to, at least to some extent, continuing now that the pandemic is over. So there's actually more people in the woods overall than there were before. So that's another thing. And then if they're outside in the woods, then they might have encounters with animals outside also, not just outside of their houses.
Yeah, we don't know how long that has continued or will continue. But people did report anecdotally again and again that they found that they needed nature. It wasn't only that it was the only place to go. It's once they were there, again, this sense of solace and not feeling alone in the world. This has a lot to do with a pandemic that began before the COVID pandemic, which is the pandemic or epidemic of loneliness that's recently gotten more coverage in the media. When I wrote Our Wild Calling, that was already being talked about quite a bit. And, the reasons that are given for this huge rise in human loneliness, which is actually killing many of us. Human isolation is associated with many of the same diseases caused by smoking and obesity. The reasons that the science was giving for that happened to be many of the same exact reasons that kids weren't going outside and playing anymore for nature deficit disorder. The attachment to electronics, the urban design, told to go for a walk where in many cities? You'll run into a freeway ring. The withdrawal from a sense of community with other people. And there are many other reasons, but they were almost always reflective of the same reasons for nature deficit disorder, for the disconnection between children and the rest of us from nature. And that's another thing that was made clear. There's another issue that the pandemic made more clear to many people, was the inequity of parks, of access to nature in cities. That wealthier neighborhoods have parks. Wealthier neighborhoods really have a lot more access to nature than some of the others. And that needs to change. And a lot of urban planners and mayors are now trying to make some effort to change that.
Yeah, that's actually really good. And actually there was a foundation that's nationwide, and I forget what it was called, but they used to, the Trust for Public Land. And they used to try to get parkland as natural parkland. And then at some point, I think like 3 or 4 years ago, they changed their mission to just start making natural playgrounds that they build from scratch. So there's no nature at all except for the trees that they put in there. You know, they put in a few trees and stuff. And they're using those same arguments of like equity and stuff like that. But it's not the same to have like a playground that they constructed with bright colors, like, you know, bright colors you could see from the sky, as opposed to just leaving a natural area as it is, which is what they were doing before. Like there's a Boy Scout camp on Staten Island that they got preserved as a natural area before they changed their mission. And then after they changed their mission, there's a playground they constructed in Brooklyn and another one in Queens that looks like just any other playground, except it's a little bit brighter colors, maybe a few more slides or something, or a couple more trees, but it's not really the same as bringing nature into that neighborhood.
Depends on the playground.
Right.
This is a movement that is happening in the United States, Canada, and many other places, which is the Green Schoolyards movement. And
Mm-hmm.
the Children of Nature Network, which is the nonprofit that grew out of Last Child in the Woods, uh, which I was a co-founder of. One of its big projects is Light Trust for Public Land, is to encourage cities to create more natural play spaces. And they mean pretty natural. They mean replacing cement and asphalt with vegetation. You can have school gardens, vegetable and other kinds of gardens on the schoolyard, but also the landscape that kids can roll down a slope and get up on a log and actually fall off of it and learn to fall safely. And things that they can climb that are made out of natural materials. In addition to that is planting native species of vegetation, which attracts the insects that are the basis of the food chain. There's an effort that goes beyond natural schoolyards, which is uh, uh, it's called trying to think of he's my friend. I'm embarrassed I'm forgetting his name. Uh, he wrote a book called Bringing Nature Home, and another one more recently, Nature's Last Hope or First Hope. And uh, the idea is that we can all create more nature in cities, in our yards, or if we don't have a yard, even a window box on the roofs of our buildings, by planting native plants. And again, that brings back uh, the native insects. My wife and I did that, and where we lived before, and I was amazed at the plants, the insects that I had never seen before in that yard. They were native California butterflies, etc. Um, and what that does is that brings back the birds that depend on those insects, and on and on. If enough people do that, if it's not just my yard, but that yard, and onward, pretty soon you have wildlife corridors on private land lacing throughout cities. If we think large enough, that cities can have more biodiversity. I mentioned the loneliness thing. What I didn't say is that one of the reasons that in Our Wild Calling, and I added to the list of reasons that others have suggested for the loneliness epidemic, I added species loneliness. That as a species, we are desperate to not feel alone in the universe. We've been that way from the beginning. This is deep within us, and it has religious implications, obviously. But the truth is, we're not alone, and we've never been alone. Those areas of research I mentioned, the amount of conversation going on around us all the time, among animals, among vegetation, we can sense that. That is out there. And the more we become aware of that, just as during the pandemic, I think the less alone we will feel.
Yeah, and the book that you're mentioning, the Nature's Best Hope, which is Douglas Tallamy's book,
Yeah,
um,
don't tell me.
he had went to the High Line in New York City. I think it's in
Mm.
Brooklyn. It might be in Manhattan. Yeah, it's in Manhattan. And he found that so he just stood there and just like became still so that like bugs would come back, instead of being scared away. And he found that there were a ton of pollinators, there were other native insects, and the High Line was only constructed a few years ago. So it didn't even take that long for them to put those native trees and plants and stuff that support all these other animals and for them to come back. And nobody thought they would come back because it's literally in the middle of Manhattan. It's right in the middle of the city, but they came anyway. And now that's like where they live and where they get food and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's really pretty amazing how fast people can change something like that, like their own backyard. Like you can bring bees back to your backyard even if they were never there before. And
Yeah.
it's actually easier
And
than people even think.
and Doug calls that the homegrown national park, the idea of replanting churchyards, backyards, places like the highland with native species and playgrounds. And even soccer fields, we can plant native plants on the edges, around the edges. People can still play soccer. Um, he calls that the homegrown national park. Interestingly, that got some pushback from some people in the National Park Service, high up, that I happen to know, who said that, well, can't use that name, national park, 'cause that's ours, which I thought was crazy because how many national parks, how many nations are there? Um, so I've suggested that we think even bigger than that and that we create a worldwide homegrown park. And so that kids in San Diego or Staten Island can replant their yards or any open space around them with natives back, and then record what comes back, what appears, and then get on the internet and talk to kids in Sri Lanka who are doing the same thing and compare notes about what have you seen return, what species. Be a great learning tool for kids about biology. Something you mentioned about the suggested the biodiversity issue of giving more biodiversity or creating more in our cities. Some people are afraid of that because of what are called zoonotic diseases. Uh, COVID probably was a zoonotic disease, and there are others. And those are diseases that jump from animals to people. There's recent research that suggests it's the other way around. Not only also, but maybe more so from human beings to other animals. Uh, and there's good evidence that the more biodiverse a, um, a place is, the more protection we have from zoonotic diseases. So rather than reducing or fighting wildlife in our cities, maybe we ought to be increasing it to protect not only us, but them from zoonotic diseases.
Okay. So the next question that I had is you can hear me now and everything, right? Okay.
Yeah.
What are some of the benefits of connecting with the natural world and animals?
Uh, well, when I wrote Last Child in the Woods, came out in 2005, I could only find 60 studies in the whole world. And I had some academic folks helping me look for them. I could only find 60 studies of either the disconnect between children and adults from the natural world or the benefits of health, of physical health, psychological health, uh, cognitive functioning. 60 studies in the whole world. Something so fundamental and so large, I was astonished. Uh, and I think I came to the conclusion there are several reasons for that gap. One of them is who funds the research? What pill can you sell? Uh, but since 2005, it's become kind of a growth industry. Now there are well over 1,300 studies, abstracts of those studies. You can find those on the Children and Nature Network website, which is childrenandnature.org. And it's the largest collection in the world, by the way, of abstracts about the studies, both of the divide, but also of the benefits. And just the evidence keeps pouring in. It was true in 2005, but now there's more and more evidence that our association with nature, that this is fundamental to who we are, and that we gain, evidence that attention deficit disorder, the symptoms are reduced pretty dramatically just with a walk in the woods in a park in an urban area for kids as young as 5. Other things are reduction of depression, cognitive functioning. Kids do better in school when at least part of the day is spent outdoors. Not all kids, but they pick up kids who normally would not have been learning well. The list goes on, and I would recommend that people go to the Children Nature Network and look at all the evidence that's out there. It's amazing. And it continues through our lives. Older people, it may reduce dementia, the possibility of dementia, the more time we spend in the garden or the woods. In any case, the list is very long, and cognitive functioning, by the way, I think I mentioned, is one of the things it recommends that we should begin to change our schools and spend more time learning outdoors. I can't tell you how many teachers that I've met over the years who come up to me after my sermonettes and say, the troublemaker in my class, when I get the class outside in nature, the troublemaker becomes the leader, not just better behaved, the leader. And it's made me wonder, how many leaders are we losing? Often those are the kids sitting at the back of the class and dressed in black. And they're sullen, they don't talk much, or they talk at the wrong time. When many of those kids, you get them outside, and as the teachers have told me, for many years I've heard this, they become the leaders.
That's amazing. And what would you say are some of the hazards of this connection, if there are any?
Well, all of the benefits, if the way I look at it is it's better to look at the benefits than assume that there's something wrong with a kid or an adult if they don't get enough nature. It's what they're missing out on. And that's why, I've never said nature deficit disorder is some kind of diagnosable, medically a diagnosis. It's a way to talk about this thing that's been happening for a long time that we had no language to describe. And I didn't know when I wrote Last Child in the Woods how beneficial that corny phrase, nature deficit disorder, would be. Because suddenly we now had a hanger we could hang this issue on, and begin to understand it, like just calling it that.
Right. So, have you ever witnessed an animal go against their instinct or judgment to help another being or do something that you wouldn't have expected?
I haven't witnessed that much myself. Maybe I should pay even more attention and I would see it more. But, Instagram is filled with videos like that. And most of them are probably true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I know, like PETA has found that, like, for example, like a mouse will endanger itself to save another mouse if it thinks it can, or even if it can't, it might just try to save it anyway, even if they both end up, getting harmed.
Yeah.
So what would be like the most important thing for parents to learn about helping their children to connect with animals and nature?
There are several of kind of the basic important things, but it's hard to answer with just a few things, which is why the second book, it's actually the second book, Vitamin N for Nature. It's the kind of book I don't like to read, but at some point I felt it was needed because I kept hearing from parents and teachers lots of great ideas about how to get kids connected to nature. So I collected those and I collected a lot of other things. And that book has 500 actions that families and schools and places of worship and whole cities can do. Some of the basics are uh, first, don't assume your kid's going to get that naturally. It doesn't come naturally necessarily. Once they're in nature, it does. But that first step is a pretty big one. My parents took it for granted that I would be out in those woods with my dog. You can't take that for granted anymore.
Right.
Another thing is to experience nature with your kids, ironically. Ultimately, solitary experiences of nature in nature are often what we most lack, or what children have the least of. But there's something about learning about nature with your parent or a sensitive adult that leaves a lasting impression. And we're not talking about going out in the woods with your kids and hovering over them with nature flashcards. We're talking about discovering together. Sometimes I think it's better for the parents not to know that much about a plant or an animal, but to discover it together with their kids. That's what you remember as a kid. And you look up and you see the look in their parents' eyes when they're surprised and they feel that sense of awe and wonder. That's what kids remember.
Right. Right. So, and I think that we kind of covered a little bit about the research, but with regard to learning and growing for kids, not so much like the benefits about like depression and things of that nature. In your research, you found that exposure to nature helps them to actually learn better and to grow, I guess, more maturity from these kinds of experiences.
Yeah, as I mentioned, with what teachers often say to me about the troublemakers in class, and that word troublemakers is sometimes um, controversial because you don't want to call them troublemakers, but that's what teachers say to me, and that's often the word they use. Um, and I was that kind of kid, by the way. I needed to be outdoors. Uh, and fortunately, I had a few teachers that knew that. Uh, but you have to ask also why. What is going on there? That you see these amazing psychological and cognitive benefits, learning ability. E.O. Wilson, the famous professor at Harvard, who died a couple of years ago, who I met and interviewed, he talked about what he called the biophilia hypothesis. And biophilia is not his coined word that it pre-existed. It's about love of life. But his biophilia hypothesis held that as a species, we are hardwired to have an affiliation with the rest of nature. It's in us. It's part of our DNA. And when we don't get enough of that, we don't do so well. This is fundamental to our humanity, to who we are. And by cutting ourselves off from nature, particularly in the developing years of kids, we're cutting ourselves off from our humanity, from our ability to see larger, to feel more, and to learn better.
And so, like in the field that you are in, you are seeing more people come to an awareness of this and kind of try and bring more nature into their lives. Like just in your experience, are you finding that it's continuing to grow in terms of like more people learning about it, more people implementing these things in their lives? And as you said, obviously the research is definitely coming out about it in much larger quantities. So would you say that it's still continuing to grow and that there's like a lot of hope for the future that, some of these trends can be reversed?
I think there's a lot of hope, and I think a lot of that is happening. I want to be careful here because those same barriers still exist, and they can be changed over time, but they haven't gone away. We're just learning to overcome them a little better. So there may be many kids that are having less experience in nature. I mean, something that pediatricians have noticed is that parents are handing iPhones and iPads to infants even earlier in their lives. Um, but there are these good things that are happening. For instance, pediatricians. I was asked to give the keynote address in 2010 to the American Association, American Pediatrics Association, and talked about 5,000 pediatricians and pediatric nurse practitioners and others in the audience. And they asked me to talk about nature deficit disorder, which was a big surprise. I mean, really, I'm always careful that this isn't a medical diagnosis, but I was astounded at their response. And now you see pediatricians all over the country, now in Canada and other countries, beginning to literally prescribe nature, to write prescriptions, or sometimes they prefer the word recommendation to prescription. Apparently, to some folks, only drugs get prescribed. But this is happening. And I was curious as to, why they would respond so positively. And this was explained to me by actually some pediatric occupational therapists and pediatric nurse practitioners and others. Pediatricians are so frustrated now that in terms of the morbidity that has increased in so many areas for kids, suicide in kids is getting younger and younger. Loneliness in kids is getting worse and worse. I mean, for the first time, probably in hundreds of years, if not much longer, young people are more lonely than old people. Now, what does that say about a society when we have reversed what has been true for so long? So pediatricians and others who deal with children, including teachers, have been very frustrated. And whatever they've been doing, whatever pills they've been prescribing may have helped a bit, but they know they're not working to the degree that they should be. So the idea of nature is a way to balance some of the deficits in children's lives and in our lives, I think has caught on partly because of that frustration.
Well, that's really good to hear, because especially like when you think about like the drugs and stuff versus like nature exposure is free most of the time unless you're building it in your backyard or something like that. But for the most part, you just go outside and it doesn't cost anything, and you're not getting a prescription and a drug and all of that kind of stuff. So that's really encouraging to hear that pediatricians are kind of going down that route, which is definitely a more healthier than just giving them drugs all the time that might have side effects and all kinds of other things.
But then there is the equity issue. I mean, it's people have different abilities or different access to nature, and others, in addition to pediatricians, are starting to pay attention. The Children Nature Network is now in partnership with the National, the American Academy, I'm sorry, I'm blanking. It's the association that connects about 18,000 mayors in the United States. Mm-hmm. And this is an effort to work with mayors around the country and other urban officials to begin to create more nature-rich cities. And that can be more parks. It can be, like we talked about, more backyards with natural species. It could be natural schoolyards. There's a lot of ways to do that, particularly if you involve the local neighborhood in that. Urban gardens are another thing that can happen. We have to begin to think of our cities as potentially nature rich. If they don't become nature rich in every neighborhood, then there's always going to be that equity issue that some kids, we can preach at the parents all we want. Uh, and if it's not there, it's not. If it's not there, it's not there.
Right.
And I want to add to that, it's not just the access that counts. That's primary, but it's also to know what to do with that access, uh, to value it.
Right. So that was all the questions that I have. Did you have anything that you'd like to add that maybe we didn't cover?
No, I'm glad you're doing this, and the Children Nature Network. You can read all my books and buy them all, but you can get a lot of this information also for free on the Children Nature Network, and it's supporting a movement that is spreading around the world. Even China now is really big on this issue.
That's great. As I know previously, especially like before COVID, they were like the biggest polluter and stuff. So, and they had like were
Well, they still are. I mean,
they
but
still
we
are,
are
but they're
too.
trying to make a headway into bringing more nature. That's definitely good. So it was
Yeah.
really great to meet with you, and I'm so glad that you were able to take the time out to do this interview. It was really nice to meet you.
And you, thank you.
Thank you so much. And
Bye.
once it posts and everything, once it publishes, I will definitely let you know, as well as your publisher, just so that you can view it if
Okay,
you'd like.
great. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.